The courtroom was suffocating with anticipation, every seat filled with restless bodies and pounding hearts. The air crackled with tension as Judge Raymond Foster, a dignified man in his 60s with an air of unwavering authority, adjusted his glasses. He took a deep breath, bracing himself to deliver the verdict that would decide one man's fate. The entire town had been captivated by the trial, its people divided in their opinions, their whispers filling coffee shops and dinner tables for weeks. At the defendant's table, Mr. Carter sat motionless, his hands clasped together as if already resigned to his destiny. Across from him, Miss Donovan, the relentless prosecutor, held her head high, confidence radiating from her poised stance. Meanwhile, Mr. Holloway, the defense attorney, gripped his notes so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his gaze locked onto the judge. A hush fell over the courtroom, every spectator holding their breath, waiting for the final strike of the gavel that would either condemn or liberate a man. Then out of nowhere, a voice shattered the silence. "Stop the trial. Please, sir. I have something to say." Gasps rippled through the room like waves crashing against the shore. Heads whipped around in search of the voice that had dared to interrupt this pivotal moment. There, standing in the gallery, was Ethan Miller, a trembling 12-year-old boy, his face flushed, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. His mother reached for him, desperation flickering in her eyes as she whispered frantically for him to sit down. But Ethan stood firm. His heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum, but he couldn't let fear hold him back anymore. Judge Foster's piercing gaze landed on the boy, his face carved from stone. "Young man, this is highly inappropriate. Sit down at once." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat but didn't waver. His voice shook, but his determination burned bright. "Please, sir, I know something important, something that changes everything." A murmur spread through the crowd like wildfire, voices rising in confused whispers. The weight of Ethan's words gripped the room, thickening the tension until it was almost unbearable. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as he studied the boy before him. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Approach the bench." Ethan's legs felt like they were made of lead as he stepped forward, every eye in the room drilling into him. The walk past the rows of stunned spectators felt endless. His chest tightened, and his hands trembled at his sides, but he refused to back down now. This moment was bigger than his fear. "What do you know?" Judge Foster's voice was softer now, edged with curiosity rather than frustration. Ethan hesitated, his gaze flickering to Mr. Holloway, who gave him a slow, reassuring nod. He turned to Miss Donovan, who watched him with wary, scrutinizing eyes, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Taking a deep breath, Ethan steadied himself. "I was at the park that night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The night Mr. Carter was supposed to have killed Mr. Lewis. I... I saw something." The room collectively inhaled, a sharp intake of breath that sent a ripple of unease through the space. Mr. Carter, who had been silent throughout most of the trial, suddenly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto Ethan's face with something that resembled desperate hope. The courtroom froze, every soul waiting, clinging to the edge of this revelation. Judge Foster leaned forward, his eyes dark with intent. "And what exactly did you see?" The town of Mill Haven had always been a peaceful place, a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's names, where crime was an anomaly rather than the norm. That peace had been shattered the night Alyssa Green was murdered. The news sent shockwaves through the town, replacing security with suspicion, warmth with fear. Rumors spread like wildfire, twisting and distorting with every retelling. Everyone wanted justice. Everyone needed a culprit. And soon enough, the police delivered one. Lucas Hart, Alyssa's boyfriend, was arrested, his face plastered across newspapers and television screens. his name whispered in hushed conversations behind closed doors. The evidence against him was circumstantial, thin, fragile, hardly enough to hold weight. But the town needed someone to blame, and Lucas fit the role too well. People saw what they wanted to see. They heard what they wanted to hear. And soon he was guilty in their eyes before he ever stood trial. But not everyone believed it. Not everyone was willing to accept the truth they were being fed. Ethan Miller had watched the case unfold from the sidelines, his young mind piecing together fragments that others ignored. He had always noticed the little details, the things people overlooked, the inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. And there was something about this case that gnawed at him, something that wouldn't let him rest. Because Ethan had been there that night. He had seen Lucas. But Lucas hadn't been with Alyssa. He had been arguing with another woman. The memory replayed in Ethan's mind like a haunting film reel. He had been riding his bike near the old train tracks when he saw Lucas standing under the dim glow of a street lamp. His voice had been raised, his hands curled into fists, not in violence, but in frustration. And the woman he had been arguing with, she wasn't Alyssa. Ethan had been too far to see her face, but something about the way she stood, the way she tilted her head ever so slightly, made his stomach twist with unease. Yet no one had mentioned her, not in the investigation, not in the news reports, not in the courtroom. She was a ghost, erased from the story. The trial had been racing toward an inevitable conclusion. Lucas convicted, condemned, forgotten. The prosecution painted him as a jealous monster, a man consumed by rage and betrayal. The defense fought, but their arguments barely chipped at the solid wall of doubt built against him. It was only a matter of time, and Ethan had known. He had known the truth all along, and yet fear kept his lips sealed. He was just a kid. Who would believe him? His own parents had dismissed him. His friends laughed it off. But the truth gnawed at his soul, and as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. With his heart thundering in his chest, Ethan pushed himself to his feet. "Lucas didn't do it," he declared, his voice breaking. "I know who did." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief painted across every face. His mother's horrified whisper reached him, but he stood firm. Judge Foster's eyes locked onto his, sharp and searching. "And who would that be, young man?" Ethan swallowed hard. His hands shook at his sides, but he didn't falter. "It was a blonde woman," he said. I saw her arguing with Lucas that night." Lucas knew there was no turning back now. The truth was out. Whether the court believed him or not, he had done what he had to do. His fate, perhaps the entire trial, had just shifted in an instant. The courtroom erupted into chaos, gasps rippling through the spectators as they exchanged stunned glances. The once stale air now crackled with tension. The prosecutor, Miss Donovan, scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's ridiculous," she sneered, her voice laced with skepticism. "A 12-year-old's testimony? That's hardly credible. He could have seen anyone that night." Ethan's face burned under the weight of her words, but he refused to back down. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his voice remained unwavering. "I know what I saw," he declared firmly. "And I remember something else. She had a keychain with the initials AG. It wasn't Alyssa. She had a sister." The room fell into a stunned silence. Mr. Holloway, the defense attorney, furrowed his brow and frantically flipped through his case files. The judge leaned forward, his gaze unreadable. Spectators shifted uneasily, waiting for the next revelation. Mr. Holloway's hands stilled as his eyes widened in shock. His voice, though low, carried urgency. "Alyssa's sister, Amanda Green." A ripple of shock coursed through the crowd. The name alone sent an electric charge through the atmosphere. Miss Donovan stiffened, her once unshakable confidence faltering for the first time since the trial began. The judge rapped his gavel twice, demanding order. His sharp gaze locked onto Ethan. "Young man, are you certain of this?" he asked, his voice steady but pressing. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I saw her that night," he insisted. "She was the one arguing with Lucas, not Alyssa." Another wave of gas filled the courtroom, but the energy had shifted. The weight of Ethan's words settled over the jurors, the spectators, and most importantly, the judge. Enough, the judge declared, his tone decisive. This changes everything. I am calling a recess. Officers, bring in Amanda Green for questioning immediately. The bailiffs moved swiftly, disappearing through the heavy wooden doors. A flurry of hushed speculation buzzed through the courtroom. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. Lucas, still seated at the defense table, let out a shaky breath, his expression caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. Miss Donovan turned to the judge, grasping for control. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The trial, the trial is now in question, Judge Foster interrupted, his voice resolute. If new evidence is coming to light, we must investigate. Ethan sat frozen as reality settled in. He had set something in motion, something far greater than he had anticipated. There was no stopping it now. As he looked around, he heard Amanda Green's name whispered from every corner of the room. And for the first time, doubt clouded the certainty of Lucas Hart's guilt. Within hours, law enforcement executed a search warrant at Amanda's home. What they found erased any remaining doubts. Hidden deep in the back of her closet was a diary, its pages filled with obsessive, angry rants about Alyssa. And then, the most damning page of all, a detailed account of her twisted plan. How she had lured her sister to the park that night. How she had orchestrated every moment. How she had meticulously framed Lucas Hart to take the fall. When the evidence was presented in court, the silence was deafening. The judge read through the diary, his face unreadable. The prosecution had no argument left to make. Amanda Green was guilty. Ethan sat motionless, the full weight of what he had uncovered pressing down on him. He had known something was wrong, but he had never expected it to be this dark, this sinister. His testimony had changed everything. It had saved Lucas from a lifetime behind bars. And yet, as Amanda was escorted into the courtroom in handcuffs, an icy dread curled in his stomach. She turned to him as she passed, her eyes dark and unreadable. Then a slow, bitter smirk curled on her lips. You should have stayed quiet, she whispered. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine, but he didn't look away. The judge's gavel struck the desk, final and unyielding. Amanda Green, you are hereby placed under arrest for the murder of Alyssa Green and obstruction of justice. Court is adjourned. Murmurs swelled in the courtroom, a tide of shock and relief washing over the crowd. Lucas exhaled, his hands trembling as he buried his face in them. He had been moments away from losing everything, from being condemned for a crime he hadn't committed, and now because of Ethan, he was free. Mr. Holloway placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You did something incredibly brave today. Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. His heart was still racing. He didn't feel like a hero. He had simply told the truth. But sometimes telling the truth was the hardest thing in the world to do. As Amanda was led away, her gaze lingered on him, her presence a lingering shadow. But Ethan refused to let her words haunt him. He had done what was right, no matter the consequences. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the weight of what had happened remained. The people of Mill Haven, once skeptical of him, now saw him in a different light. Neighbors who had whispered behind his back now approached him with quiet admiration. Some shook his hand, others simply nodded. Lucas walked over, his exhaustion clear, but his eyes filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be standing here right now. Ethan gave a small nod. You don't have to thank me. I just told the truth. Lucas smiled, shaking his head. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. Ethan's mother appeared at his side, wrapping him in a tight hug, tears glistening in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, and for the first time since the trial began, Ethan felt the tension in his chest ease. Justice had been served, and even though he had been afraid, he had faced it anyway. Because sometimes the truth wasn't just a burden. Sometimes it was the only thing that could set you free. Tears still shimmered in his eyes as Ethan felt his father's firm hand settle on his back. A silent but powerful reassurance. They had all been so afraid, uncertain of what would happen if he chose to speak. Fear had weighed heavily on them, the worry of consequences pressing in from all sides. But now as they stood outside the courthouse, they understood. Their son had done something extraordinary. Beyond the courthouse steps, A sea of reporters gathered, eager to capture the moment, to tell the world about the boy who had turned an entire case upside down. Cameras flashed like bursts of lightning, microphones thrust toward him, their voices a cacophony of urgent questions. Yet despite the commotion, Ethan did not feel like a hero. He was simply a kid who had done what needed to be done. The justice system had come so close to failing Lucas, so dangerously near to condemning an innocent man. It had been so quick to judge, so willing to accept surface-level evidence without truly seeking the truth. If Ethan had remained silent, if he had not found the courage to speak, Lucas would have been sentenced for a crime he did not commit. The thought sent a chill down his spine. How many others had suffered the same fate? How many had been silenced, their voices lost in the noise of assumptions and prejudice? As he stepped away from the courthouse, his mother slipped her arm around him, pulling him close. Her voice was a whisper, trembling with pride and emotion. "You did something incredible today," she said. "We couldn't be prouder." Ethan lifted his gaze to the town that had known him all his life. The people who had once seen him as just another quiet boy now looked at him with new eyes. They whispered about him, some in awe, others in disbelief. But he did not see himself as a hero. He had simply stood for what was right, and that had made all the difference. It had taken only one voice, his, to change everything. He had interrupted a courtroom, shattered expectations, and exposed the truth. He had never imagined himself at the center of such a pivotal moment, but when it mattered most, he had found the strength to stand up. And the effects of his choice rippled far beyond anything he had anticipated. The weight of it all settled upon him as he walked forward, his family close beside him. The people who had once doubted him now regarded him with respect. He was no longer just the quiet boy in the background. He had become the one who had saved an innocent man's life. His mother, once fearful of what speaking out could cost him, now squeezed his shoulder, silent tears shining in her eyes. His father, a man of few words, gave him a single nod, one that carried the weight of unspoken pride and understanding. The judge's voice still echoed in his mind. "You saved a man's life today." The memory sent a shiver down his spine. It had been terrifying to step forward, to go against the current of expectations. But now he saw why it had mattered. The truth had needed to be heard, and sometimes it took someone unexpected to ensure that it was. The reporters swarmed around them, cameras flashing like relentless stars, their voices an unrelenting tide. The town, once skeptical, now murmured about his bravery. Some called him a hero, but Ethan did not feel like one. He had simply refused to let the truth be buried. This case had revealed something deeply unsettling. How quickly assumptions could replace facts. How dangerously willing people were to accept the surface of a story without ever digging deeper. If he had remained silent, Lucas would have been lost to an unjust fate. If no one had questioned the evidence, the true culprit would have walked free. But Ethan had spoken, and because of that, the truth had come to light. As he looked at the faces around him, he understood something profound. One person could make a difference. One voice, no matter how small, could shift the course of everything. Because sometimes the truth remains hidden until someone finds the courage to uncover it. And when they do, the world is forever changed.